the confession of Peter after the resurrection of Christ. He denies him 3 times, right? During his passion. And Jesus asks him 3 times, do you love me? So each mortal sin is a turning away from the Lord, and that healing, a return back. So that's the kind of the background for the number part. If you don't remember the exact number many times, suffices, okay? You don't have to get into the hundreds of times. And like, I know it was 53 times, so none of my mortal sins are forgiven. I have to go back and some people can fall into that scrupulous trap. So that's the purpose of that number there. It's not that if you're gone a long time and you forget one, then you're not forgiven for any. That's not the purpose of it. The 10th canon, if anyone says that priests who are in mortal sin have not the power of binding and of loosening, or that not priests alone are the ministers of absolution, so that, let's say, any Christian can do it, but that to all and each of the faithful of Christ is able to absolve from sin, let them be anathema. So this is part of that understanding of the ministerial priesthood of Christ, offering the sacrifice for sins, the Christ's own sacrifice, and absolving someone from sin in the person of Christ. The 11th canon said, if anyone says that bishops have not the right of reserving cases to themselves, let them be anathema. So, in the reform of canon law in 1983, most of these reserved sins were done away with. They said, well, or that the local bishop, for instance, one sin that was often reserved to the bishop was the sin of abortion. So, if someone had committed an abortion that came to the priest and confessed it, he would have to send them down to the bishop, or make note of it and send a letter to the bishop to give the penance and so on. But the bishops in this country, I think maybe back in the 1960s, gave that, delegated that right to all of the priests with faculties to hear confession because the widespread nature of the sin anymore in our society. So, and other sins have been reserved. Historically, there had been some that the bishops, or even the Pope himself, had reserved. Currently, I don't think there are any sins that are reserved, but sometimes the penalties are reserved. So if let's say a priest breaks the seal of confession, that has to go to Rome for the penance and everything. He would confess that in the confessional. The priest who hears the confession would write a letter and send it to the apostolic penitentiary, which is not a prison, but it's a person. That's a nice joke. It's a person, and he would open it, sign the penance, and put the number on it, send it back to the priest, who would call in the penitent, give him the penance, see that he has received the penance, agrees to do it. He would, I think, record the number that's on the paper and burn it. So there are certain penalties that are still reserved for the Holy See, but to simplify canon law, in the 1980s, they kind of suspended many of these sins that before had been reserved to the bishop. So, make sense? Yeah.
What would be an example of repentance?
Penance?
Of the priest's repentance for breaking this?
Well, I mean, he could be, I don't know, I've never dealt with this. I've never had someone come in and confess this.
Sorry.
I was waiting for it.
So I can't exactly give you an example from personal experience.
Is this becoming archaic?
What's that?
Is this type of thing becoming archaic?
Well, it's just when they reformed the canon law in 1983, they decided, the bishops, the Holy Father, there was a committee to reform the canon law. This was one of the reasons the Second Vatican Council was called, was to update canon law, basically. And you might say, in some cases, maybe some of the sins were not as common and they were more archaic than they had been in the past, or they weren't as common as they had been in the past, just by the nature of the, I think one that was reserved in Eastern canon law, this is a nice little trivia point, The bishops did decide to keep one for themselves that was reserved for the bishop, and that was burning another person's barn. So barn burning was a reserved sin for the bishop. So there's, but that meant, the reason for that, historically, that you just push a person into destitution, you destroy his livelihood. But it, I mean, you hear it, it's just kind of comical. Of what?
I have a friend who's a priest from Africa.
Yeah.
And the priest approached him and asked him if he was a sin.
Oh, no. There are still reserved penalties. So the penalties are still, but let's say before, if you wanted to, let's say the barn burning case. If you wanted to be absolved from the barn burning case, you would have to go to the bishop himself. The priest couldn't. So right now, let's say it's someone who breaks the seal of confession. I, as a priest, I could absolve the person, but I don't have the authority to give that person the penance or fully reconcile the person. That has to come from. But does that make sense?
Well, my understanding of this particular case by the priest, and I have no idea. Of course,
Did he go to confession? Is what I want to know.
No, it was a priesthood confession, and it was a sin that could only be absolved by the pope.
Okay. There's more than just that one, but that was an example that you could see the gravity of. Yeah.
Asking if it was our thing.
No, but the reserving of sins. So let's say, for instance, in this country, it used to be the case that the sin of abortion was reserved for the bishop. And if you heard in confession, you would send the person down to speak with the bishop, okay, instead of taking care of it yourself, because it's been reserved. Many of those, if not all, I think, in the Western, the Latin Church, have been, and when they reformed, now they have done away with or delegated the permission to the local priest. But there are still certain penalties that are reserved. And so that's kind of a distinction in canon law, which hopefully you never really have to deal with on your own experience.
You said you could absolve, but then say I'm breaking the seal of confession,
Sure.
but then the Holy See would have to give the penance.
Mm-hmm.
Does he have the right, depending on the circumstances, to say no?
What the Holy See?
Right. I mean, if he would, depending on the circumstances.
Depending. Well, I mean, there's probably going to be in the. I've never actually had to deal with this, so this is all in
But I mean,
hypothetical
this to me
land.
would be a biggie. I mean,
Oh, sure.
I'm
But
just
I mean,
saying, does
he could be given a penance of, going to a monastery for 10 years, 20
okay,
years.
not being with the public.
Yeah, outside the
or something
public,
like
not
that.
ever being able to exercise his ministry.
So
as a
basically,
priest.
his sin is reserved just for that period of time.
No, the reserved part meant that the bishop reserved the power to. So when a priest forgives sins, right, he is exercising the ministry of the bishop. He has the faculties from the bishop to absolve the sins. And in a sense, the bishop doesn't have to give you all the faculties to absolve any possible type of sin. This is all in theory now. And there might be certain ones that he can keep to himself. All right. So now, after the Second Vatican Council, they wanted to simplify all that. So it's not something that 99.9% of Catholics ever deal with anymore. So, but there is, in theory, it's still there. I mean, if they wanted to, they could put this back into place, but they probably don't want the paperwork. Yeah.
Okay, what if I want to use you, okay, Father?
Now, is this going to keep us from getting to Vatican I?
Okay, what if the priest that had broke the seal
Yeah.
of confession, would he be able to hear confessions again?
Well, that would be, I mean, he's automatically excommunicated if he does that. Instantly. And the fact, I mean, he would have to be reconciled.